Mother Jones was a socialist who did not like the Democratic Party much better than she liked the Republican Party. But Mike Harrington is a socialist who likes the Democratic Party a whole hell of a lot better than he likes the Republican Party, and has convinced a lot of other people to share that belief. He's a kind of a model activist, Mike is, I think, because for one thing, he's a veteran. He's someone who just never quit. He's always been doing good political work when other people were taking time off. And because his contacts have been so widespread in labor, with the women's movement today, always with the civil rights movement, with anti-war movements, anti-nuclear, and with the religious community. Someone who's been influential at the top of the Democratic Party when it's been in power, at least in the Kennedy era, and at other times, and always influential at the grassroots level too. And someone who's recognized around the world by socialists internationally as an important spokesperson for American socialism. For that reason alone, people should listen to him carefully. Mike Harrington of the Democratic Socialists of America.
After that introduction, I want to make one thing clear at the outset. This is my moderate speech. It's true, because I am talking now not about the necessity to fundamentally transform this system in a democratic way, which I profoundly believe in, but how we deal right now with what is on the agenda, which is defeating Reagan and facing up to a profound crisis. They link, but this is the moderate analysis. Let me begin with a famous remark by Will Rogers. I belong to no organized political party. I am a Democrat. And whenever that comes up, people think, aren't we an amusing and lovable people to be like that? And my answer is, yes, we are indeed an amusing and lovable people, but it is not good enough anymore. We have to grow up. That what we need in the United States is not a third party, a second party, or a first party, but a party. That is to say, we have in the United States no political institution in which members work out a program which is presented to the public and in which the elected officials of that institution then follow out the program and pass it into law. It doesn't exist. And that is not true simply of the Democratic Party, it's true of the Republican Party, because imagine the Republican Party for 1 second without Ronald Reagan, and everybody would be at everybody else's throats. And in the past, maybe that was okay, but I believe now we are facing a crisis which is temporarily, for the period of the election, apparently in abeyance, but is very real, and unless we get a Democratic Party that cares about programs and ideas and structures to carry them through, this country is in deep, deep trouble. Let me give you the worst and the second worst possibility of 1984. The worst possibility is Ronald Reagan is reelected and faces this terrible crisis which will come in 85 or 86, and moves to military adventurism as a way to get out of it politically. That's the worst. And what's the second worst? That Mondale and Ferraro are elected and the crisis hits and they don't know what to do about it. And I think that's what we have to face up to here. And I don't think, thus far, it's my impression that it's being faced up to clearly at this convention. First, let me look at that crisis. Let me look at what you might call the invisible issues of this election, of the fact that I believe we are living through the greatest political hoax of the 20th century and maybe of American history. And that hoax is Reagan is saying, my economic program worked. His economic program failed totally. He looked for a supply-side recovery led by investment. He gave billions and tens of billions of dollars of the rich to promote that supply-side recovery. It did not take place. There was an investment bust. And what we got was what the London economist called Keynesianism by mistake. A demand-side liberal democratic recovery, which Ronald Reagan now, perpetrating a hoax is claiming is the result of supply side. But that recovery, that hoax, does not change the fact that this country has not even begun to face up to a radical shift in the international division of labor, where South Koreans are now producing steel not simply more cheaply than Americans, but than Japanese, where we are going through a technological revolution which strikes today in the factory, strikes tomorrow in the office, and next year or 2 or 3 years down the way in the executive suite, where we are living through a multinationalization of corporate capital that puts the American trade union movement at the greatest risk that it's been in half a century. None of those fundamental crises have been addressed by this hoax. And one of the questions I think the Democratic Party has to face up to is, will it address these crises? Wall Street knows that the crisis is coming back again. Wall Street says so every day. The corporate rich know it's coming back again. That's why the real interest rate is now 8%. It's an incredibly high real interest rate. It's because they are all discounting for the crisis that's coming. Will the Democratic Party on this issue be as radical as Wall Street? When that crisis comes, and it came, it's in abeyance, but when it comes again, who is going to pay for the wrenching transition of a restructuring of the American economy and social structure? That's coming. And not 20 years from now, maybe not next year, it is coming in the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Who pays? Do working people in their communities pay? Are corporations in the country, which is the easiest country in which to fire a worker, are they to have no responsibility for what they do? Will the Democratic Convention this week talk about a rather interesting institution in our society called the American banking system? Will it talk about the fact that as the prime rate goes up, you price Americans out of the housing market and create a depression for the building trades? That when the prime rate goes up, you price people out of automobiles? Will that be discussed? Will it be discussed that a 1% increase in the prime rate raised the interest payments of Argentina by $800 million? An Argentina that only recently came out of a long night of fascism and terror. Do we understand there was a Democratic convention in 1896 in which the man who stampeded the convention said, "Thou shalt not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." But isn't that happening again? And if there is an explosion in the third world because of that incredible agony, what will our response be? A hemispheric Vietnam? Is that our answer to this crisis? Don't we have to, in this Democratic Party, in this country, talk about those kinds of issues? So the first thing I say, we need a party, we need a Democratic Party that will begin to face issues which I think are going to transform our lives. But secondly, some of the things that Tom said, Pat Caddell said, how do you unite the different constituencies that the Democratic Party appeals to? The trade unions, the middle and upper middle class, the underclass. How do you unite them when those class differences are also sliced by gender differences, by race differences, and by differences on the issue of war and peace? Where is the unity? What integrates the Democratic Party? First, let me deal with some nonsense. Is the Democratic Party the party of special interests like the labor movement? That is very dangerous nonsense. At a time when the American trade unions were being pushed back, when workers were being laid off, when workers were giving up gains they had made, the Reagan administration wrote a tax bill that gave the Treasury away to the rich. And when anybody talks about special interests and says blacks are a special interest, Hispanics are, poor are, Asians are, women are, we have to say that is absolute nonsense. The special interests are the corporate rich whose priorities are permeating our society. Wait till I come back and give my radical speech. But there's a second sense in which the special interest charge does stick, in one sense. And I want to go back to the 30s. Why was it that the trade union movement in the 1930s was not seen as a special interest? Because it was perceived as doing something that was in the interest of the whole country as well as itself. Because it represented a vision, not simply for the members, but for the society, right? Why was it that Martin Luther King, leading a movement whose black members, 12% of the population, in the 1960s, was able to energize the society, to transform not simply black America, but white America as well? His movement gave white America back its soul. Why? Because it was not simply a movement of black people for their special interest. It was a movement of black people for the dream of the United States of America, which was the interest of all of us. And I think what we have to do, in this Democratic Party, in this America of ours, is to link those interests to some kind of a vision. Now, let me get very specific. The two most dynamic political movements, social movements in 1984 politically, have been minorities and women. That's obvious. The demands of minorities and women for full employment, for comparable worth, for blacks receiving as much as whites and browns and Asians and all the rest, for women receiving as much as men, those special interest demands, I think, are potentially, like the demands of the trade union movement in the 1930s, they are demands which link up with the common interest of the overwhelming majority of the American people. To defeat racism and sexism in this society, you have to adopt policies which are going to reach out and enormously help trade unionists, including white male trade unionists. And also, we have to say, it seems to me, in making this point, to the yuppies, and do not write them off. Because if there are people in this society who think, well, one can look down at the trade union movement, I've got mine, Jack, the yuppies have to understand they are standing in line. The crisis is going to hit everybody. It hits the poor and the minorities first, it hits the working people second, it is going to hit everybody. And I think what we have to say is, in this society, if we respond to the demands of the black and other minority movements and the women's movement, we have to create a society which is better for almost everybody. One last point here. In the 1950s and 60s, it was well understood in America that it was good even for the rich to have workers paid a decent wage, because then they could buy back what they produced, to put it very simply. And what kind of an America are we building now by pushing wages down, by turning steel workers into fast food workers or into electronic component workers, by building an economy on Silicon Valley, which is a poorly paid valley? And we have to frame these things not in terms of a laundry list of what's in it for me, but in terms of the notion that the demands made by particularly women and minorities are demands which I believe could unite this entire society. Last main point, vision. We need vision. Everybody's for a vision. But what do we want when we say we need a vision? Do we want some Democratic Party poetry? Do we just want some songs? I'm for the poetry and the songs. Just poetry and songs? When Martin Luther King, in 1963, gave that speech in Washington, he did not simply say, I have a dream. He said that. But he said, I have a dream, standing at the head of a mass movement which had mobilized millions in the street who had confronted police dogs He said, I have a dream, and by that dream I mean right now the Public Accommodations Act, which was finally passed in 1964. The vision has to be tied to something very specific, or else it's simply hot air. And the problem is to combine the two. I have thought for some time what Pat Cadell was saying. I have thought for some time that in 1980, Ronald Reagan was the radical candidate, the visionary candidate, the utopian candidate, the daring candidate, the candidate who said, everything we have been doing is wrong. I am going to go off in an absolutely new direction. And I think that we have to get some sense of that in the Democratic Party. If a Fritz Mondale says, I am for women's rights, I hope that a woman someday will be president of the United States, that's the vision as vapors. When a Mondale names Geraldine Ferraro as the running mate, that's the vision coming true. And can Mondale find a way to do that for minorities, for working people, for the poor, the equivalent? There's not the equivalent, but by taking a specific that contains a vision. And can he do it on an area where one could get a little concerned about the future, national security? So I want to tell you something. If the Democrats win, as I devoutly hope, and as I'm going to work morning, noon, and night, comes the victory I'm going to celebrate for 5 minutes, and then start organizing to be sure that what's good in that victory gets done, and above all, that there be a real move for peace and a real move against any intervention in Central America. But more than that, let me speak to something which is not always the language and rhetoric of the left. My friend Norman Thomas, who was 6 times the Socialist Party candidate for President of the United States, in one of the last speeches he gave when he was almost blind, near death, 1965, the fall of 65, Norman Thomas went down to Washington, D.C. to the same nuclear policy rally against American intervention in Vietnam. And he said something there that was profound, that I wish everybody had learned at that time, and I hope we can learn now. He said, "We are not here to burn the American flag. We are here to cleanse the American flag." I do not want Ronald Reagan to speak as if he speaks for America. I believe we speak for America. I believe that when we say we should have reached out to the Sandinistas when they triumphed, now we should reach out to them, we should reach out to the movement in Salvador, that is not crazy idealistic politics. That is the only serious kind of politics for the real national security of the United States. So I think we have not a party, we have to create a party. I think we are in between a crisis, which is a difficult time. I think we have to explain the hoax that is being perpetrated on the American people. I think we have to come up with programs and ideas. I think we have to take that lead that the women and the minorities are giving us and generalize it to the entire country. And finally, I would conclude to tell you what I would like us to do with this Democratic Party, with this campaign. In terms of an experience of mine, which was one of the most moving experiences of my life, it was in 1965 at the end of the Selma-Montgomery March. And we all marched into Montgomery, and the city was deserted. We were protected by federalized troops. There was no one on the street. It was eerie. There were simply the federalized troops, all of whom were Southern, mainly white, local people who hated us. And as we went through the city towards the place where the big rally was going to take place in front of the State House, the birthplace of the Confederacy, all we saw were Confederate flags. And finally we got there, and somebody looked way out in the distance and saw an American flag. And we sang the most radical song I have ever heard in my life. It was called the Star-Spangled Banner, because we were saying, we, the civil rights movement, we are America. We have a vision. We have a vision that speaks to the entire country. We are not a special interest. We are the American interest. We have to find that way to take our issues and define them and present them in the interest of the entire American people. That's our job in 1984.